Welcome to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Podcast. My name is Will Franz, and I'm here to help you improve your training so you can have more fun out on the trails. Welcome to the second one of these of the new year. Sorry, it's been a little longer than planned. It's been a busy week at work and all sorts of stuff. When you work in a gym, the new year is obviously, or I would assume it's fairly obvious, it is a bit of a zoo. And it's been fun, it's positive, it's very busy, and I always want to support people like trying to better themselves in a fitness capacity, but it's been kind of a mess, so sorry for the delay. Anyway, let's get into the podcast or video this week. First, with just starting with a quick tip, I'm trying to do more of these, that hamstrings, I think, are an underappreciated muscle group when it comes to distance or like long distance running. And it's not because they necessarily like pull the heel up towards your butt in the like cycle of running. They do that to some degree, but a lot of that is also fascially driven. Like it's not this big thing that you're going to yank your heel up to your butt. That is more true if we're going to do something like sprinting. It is less true for like really long distance stuff. But they are a big thing if we're looking at going downhill, because hamstrings tend to be a big driver in your like braking mechanism when you are running. If you hear about a lot of people in like football or sports with a lot of sprinting, they hurt their hamstrings a lot, and it's because they train them really heavy in the gym, and then when they go to stop, they're overworked and they pull or tear something. And if we look at basic biomechanics, if your knee is behind your toe and you're kind of like hinging down a little bit, then your hamstrings are going to do some work. It's also going to be your glutes and calves and other things, but we will often talk about glutes and training glutes. We will often talk about calves and training calves. I think we underappreciate the function of the hamstring in many of our training modalities. So that's a very important thing for us to keep in mind. So if you don't really train your hamstrings, then that is the thing we should probably work into our strength work this year. I've been doing a lot more myself, and I've been incorporating, it's not that it wasn't a focus prior, it's just going to be more of a focus in this coming year for a lot of the people with whom I'm working. Because if you are running downhill, yes, your quads are going to hurt. That is a very, very clear thing. We know they're going to hurt. If you've ever experienced it, they're on fire. And that is because the like down or eccentric phase of any movement tears more muscle fibers. So if we are running downhill, you are constantly in this like eighth of a single leg squat, your quads are going to get torn apart and they're going to catch a lot of weight. But we're also in this like very mild one-legged Romanian deadlift for about a quarter second. And if we weren't braking with our hamstrings, you would accelerate forever until you either hit terminal velocity or probably fell down first. So we need to have our stronger hamstrings. They'll protect your quads, they'll protect your calves, and it'll be a bigger thing on the downhill, and it'll just keep you safer. They also function very much as like a functional ACL. They keep your knee pulled back, then like locked into place. And if we don't have very good hamstrings, you're more likely to get ACL damage. So train your hamstrings. It can make a big difference in the long run. Now, let's look at the main topic for the day, or the night, is going to be how to put together a yearly running plan. Now, by now, a lot of people at least have some idea of what their race structure is. If you applied to one of the big lotteries, you either got in or you probably didn't, because most people don't. And if you did, congratulations. If you didn't, I'm sorry. Hope you get into one of the ones next year and you're at least running some races you want to be running. But first, you're probably only going to peak a couple times per year. That's a very real thing that we should recognize, and those times are probably not going to be back-to-back in like July and August. We're going to have some separation between those two. If you are a non-professional, like highly talented out the gate athlete running 100 milers, then you're you're probably going to need at least 3 months of like recovery in order to peak again effectively. Doesn't mean that you can't run more races than that. It doesn't mean you can't perform really well at multiple races. But if we were looking at peaking and prioritization, then we should pick a few races that are separate on your calendar. Now, once we know what those races are and we have our like A races and B races and C and whatever list you have made at this point, then we should figure out the demands of your race. And this feels really silly, but there's so many times when we talk to people and they like don't even know the relative elevation change or how many aid stations they're going to be. And this can really affect your training. If we look at something, I think it's the Bigfoot 40 or whatever, circumvents Rainier, and there's like an aid station. So if you aren't ready to carry stuff for 20 miles, then that is going to be a big problem. So we should be aware of that when it comes to training. You should know how far it is, or at least kind of how far it is. If you're running something hosted by Laz, you might not get an actual metric, but you can at least get in the ballpark that it's going to be far. We should know what the general elevation gain and loss will be. You should know the hammering that your body is going to take changing elevation. There is a large difference between how you would train for 100 miles around a trek and something like Array that has 40,000 feet, I think, of gain during 100 miles. We should know what the general temperature is going to be. If it's going to be 50 degrees and generally sunny, lovely. And yes, I also recognize you are not going to know that information until time, but we can look at some of the past races and see what temperature was more or less like. We can look at averages for temp on the day and just know what weather is like in that area of the country. Know whether you have a high risk for rain or snow or ice or whatever. Make sure that we have some ability to figure out weather. And then terrain. If we look at something like the Hurt 100, it is notoriously difficult, and it's not necessarily difficult because of the elevation or whatever. It's difficult because you're running across an insane amount of routes, from what I understand. Like, we need to understand what these trails or everything looks like. Are you running through sand? Are your calves going to get destroyed? Are you running on a lot of rocks where your feet are going to take a beating? If you're running a race in Moab, is it in Utah? Is it on slick rock where you should be training a lot on pavement because that's actually what that surface feels like to your body? I rarely have knee pain. The end of Dead Horse 50, like my knees started to hurt because one, I was injured ankle, so a lot of transference of muscles, but also just a lot of hammering downhill on a slightly injured ankle, so I couldn't use the muscles I wanted to be using, and my tendons and my knees were taking a beating. So we should have an idea of this. Now, once we know all of that, fill your calendar. Again, race as much as you want. Just realize that you're only going to peak a couple times a year, and it's not like going to likely be in back-to-back months. Now, once we have that, let's plan backwards. So we should figure out what is going to be like most relevant to your race, and then far away, we should do the stuff that's least relevant to your race. So I'm going to talk about this moving forward in time, but I actually like to plan this backwards. So if we are far away from your race, let's say your race is in June and it is currently January, now would be a good time to start working on things that are like your weaknesses or you're kind of bad at. So if you have a big mountain race, let's get better at hills. Let's get better at climbing. If you are anybody, and especially if you want to get faster, then we should start doing some like high-end cardio or like big neurological output work. So stuff like 5 by 3 minute hill repeats. And these are also often called like VO2 max stuff. There's a debate whether that's a relevant term or not, but who really cares? They're hard efforts that require a lot of neurological drive from your body and a lot of high-end cardio output. Now, if you were trying to run a 5K competitively, that would be very relevant to the actual race itself. If we're trying to run a like 50K, 50 miler, even a marathon, these are going to be much less relevant. So we should put the priority on them farther away. Now, if you are like not super versed in running, this can be a really good time to just get used to running a lot. And if you can build your body up to like running multiple times for like multiple miles, multiple days per week, this is a good time to set that base. So like 20 to 30 miles per week. If you can get that to feel comfortable and kind of smooth, that is a really good spot to start pretty much any training program. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have built up to 20, 30 miles per week and you immediately go into a training program. It means we've been able to hold that volume for multiple weeks on end without any real break. And you're just ready to actually start a dedicated training program. Now, if we're looking at something like strength work, from the far out perspective, this is where I like to have people lift heavy. And there's a couple reasons for this, but one, it builds a lot of like neurological drive. It gets you stronger. It gets your body working better together as a unit. If we are working close towards a like max deadlift, your entire body has to work into that motion, and it will do a lot better working as a unit farther down the line if we can build a foundation there. Now, I don't do this closer to race day because it puts just a ton of stress on your body, puts a ton of stress on your peripheral nervous system. It puts a ton of stress on your like tendons and joints. And if we're running a lot and volume is super high, tack on some speed work there, I don't think you should be doing like heavy doubles on a deadlift or a squat, but it is a useful thing to do a couple times a year to set some sort of base. Now, I also wouldn't pair that with VO2 max work. So if we're looking far away, personally, I would like start trying to build this like cardio, low, easy base of running. I would do some heavy strength work during that initial build, and then I would switch to something else when we move more towards like VO2 max stuff. That's me. Program however fits you. Now, as we move forward throughout the year, it might be time to start doing things that have a little more direct carryover to your race. So things like lactate work. And people call this tempo runs. They call it like lactate intervals. They'll talk about critical speed. It doesn't really matter. It's all these like 10 to 20 minutes at maybe like a hard hour effort or like a 10K effort. Because for most people, that's going to fall in this like 45 to 75 minute time span. And if you push hard for some intervals at 10 to 20 minutes at an effort that would toast you at about an hour, then you are going to build a good amount of lactate. Your body is going to learn to both make a little less of it, and it's going to learn to use it better as a fuel. It gets demonized. Lactic acid is not the devil. It's barely real. We make hydrogen ions with lactate and it makes your muscles burn. But if you can use that stuff better as fuel, then you will run faster and easier and things will go smoother. Now, as we get much closer to your race, this is where we really focus on building volume. So a lot of the speed work might drop off or it gets a little easier. So you might do more like 20 to 40 minute intervals, or we can turn some of those lactate intervals into, like Steve Magnus calls flux training, where you'll push hard for 10 minutes and then you won't really rest for a rest period. You will back off. So you'll still hold a decent clip, but it'll be a clip at which you can kind of recover from the hard interval. And that might be your speed work closer to race time. And you'll also be building up these like harder weekend runs. You don't need to do, or longer weekend runs. You don't need to do like the big long run every weekend. If you're gonna run a 50K, you should probably know that you can run at least 20 to 25 miles. If you're gonna run a 50 miler, you should probably be able to run at least a 50K. And we should probably toss some like back-to-back efforts in there additionally, right? Like make sure that your body is used to running and performing a little bit under a deeper amount of stress. And then once we finally get to the end, taper. And it'll be like a 10-day to 3-week taper, kind of depending on you. I very de facto do 2 weeks unless someone knows that they do better with something slightly different. During your taper, like don't toss out your speed work. We should have some level of speed work, even if it's just like strides and surges, pretty much all the way up till race day, because you want to maintain that top end. You want to maintain that like neurological connection, but definitely taper. If you're most people mess up their taper by going too hard in their taper. If you just sat around and did like nothing for 10 days from your race, your performance would suffer a little. If you don't taper at all, your performance will suffer a lot. So you're much better off undercutting your taper and just maintaining some level of volume and a little bit of speed stuff, and you will do better. Now, when we're looking at planning this backwards, like don't just wing it. You might accidentally miss something. Life can get away. You can just do the stuff you really enjoy doing and just like never really move on from a particular phase. So personally, I will plan the like larger blocks backwards. Like, oh, I have 4 months to prep for this. I'm going to do 4 months of like really good training for this race. This month will be this. Like the month but right before will be this. The month right before that will be this, and etc. And then I will plan the like individual weeks forward 1 or 2 weeks at a time because stuff comes up. Like I've almost never had 3 or 4 months of my life go perfectly to plan. So general structure, go backwards, and then specific week to week stuff, we can go forward. Now, I will also, we talked about a taper. I will toss in some like general deloads here if we finish a phase of something, be it VO2 work or lactate stuff. Like a week after that phase will be a like big cut in volume. There will still be some speed work in there. You'll still be running. We'll still try to maintain frequency, but we're going to try to like reduce volume significantly and basically mini taper and let your body adapt to the training that you've been throwing at it for weeks on end. And don't get too caught up in this. Like the standard was like 3 weeks on, 1 week off, or you'll hear 4 weeks on, 1 week off. It doesn't really carry over. It is very personally dependent, and there isn't a perfect answer here. I will usually do 4 weeks of training and then a week of rest and be very willing to adjust a plan if need be. Like if something comes up, great, make a shift. If you get sick, that is a great time to just take a de facto deload week. Like it doesn't need to be exactly where it was. And if you get a little like niggle of pain, good, take a day, take an unplanned rest day or 2 or 3 and let it recover. Like don't let a small setback in this like beautiful training plan that you wrote turn into something that is going to like compromise your actual race. I have this conversation with a lot of people a lot of the time. And it's both people I coach and people I don't. And it's a general fear we get that a couple days off is going to turn into this like long destruction of all this work we've put in. And sure, if you take a week off, you might see a mild decrease in performance, but we're talking like percentages of a percentage point. Whereas if you try to push through something like a chest cold or a like weird pull in your calf, then you're probably going to be forced to take a few weeks off or a couple months off, and then you will absolutely see a massive decrease in performance. So make sure that you don't over leverage just because you got too caught up in the plan. Make sure that we take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt and are willing to adapt on the fly to what's going on in your life. If you have kids, they might bring something home. If you work with people who just don't take super good care of yourself, you might get sick. Like make sure that you are able to make these adjustments as needed so that you can actually get the most out of out of the end goal. Like, keep the actual goal in mind. It's not checking the boxes week to week. It's performing well at your actual race. Now, just as a quick summary of all these things, like, figure out your race schedule for the year and determine which of those are like your big A races. Realize you're only going to peak a few times throughout your year. So be a little ruthless here. Like, put some gaps in between them and make sure that you actually have time to recover between your races and rebuild. It's called a peak for a reason. There's going to be a valley after that peak. If you want to race more than that, that's great, but realize that you're probably only going to really hit peak performance a couple times a year, especially for longer races. Now, if you have this all set up, then it's time to figure out the demands of those races, like distance, elevation change, what your cutoffs are, aid stations, etc. And then once we have all this information, start planning backwards accordingly to make sure that you are actually hitting all of these things during your training and prepping yourself for the race you're going to run and not some other race for which you didn't sign up. And then start by building a base and or working on your weaknesses and things least relevant to your race, and then build towards stuff that is more relevant to the actual race you're going to run. Don't forget to deload occasionally, and definitely don't skip the taper. That is how we'd set up a basic yearly training plan. I realize things are going to come up and other races might happen, but that is the basics of how we would look at it from a random point in January to get yourself across the finish line a few times throughout the year to the best of your ability. Hope that was helpful. I just made a 50K training plan that I'm giving away for free. I will post the link here in a day or two once I just make sure everything is finalized. I already sent it out to my email list if you're on that. If not, get on it, and then you'll get things like that earlier. And if not, I will post this here in the Facebook group and in the show notes soon. So I hope this general discussion was helpful, and I will be back in a couple days with another one of these. I'm going to try to be a little more consistent now that the initial January rush at the gym is over. Hope you have a great rest of your night, and I'll be back soon. See ya. Thank you for listening to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Podcast. Honestly, I'm still surprised and honored that anybody wants to hear what I have to say, so thank you. To be clear, not a doctor, nor a registered dietitian, or any other kind of medical professional. I'm a personal trainer, a nutrition coach, and a running coach, and I have a passion for training trail runners. You should always speak with a qualified medical professional before making any changes to your training or nutrition program. If you enjoyed the podcast or found it helpful, please take a second to leave a rating or review. I'd really appreciate it. Or you could just share it with someone for whom you think it might be helpful. I make these kinds of things in order to provide more quality, free resources to people, so the more people who hear it, the better. If you want more of this information, please head to the Trail and Ultra Running Training group on Facebook, where we discuss all aspects of training so you can have more fun doing the sport that you love. Thank you again for listening.